UALR Television is pleased to bring you the Clinton School Speaker Series. Throughout the year, the Clinton School of Public Service hosts national and international leaders and public figures. Here's tonight's speaker.
Juliet Alperin graduated magna cum laude from Princeton with an AB in politics and a certificate in Latin American studies. She is the national environmental reporter for the Washington Post and also covers politics there, including helping the Post cover the 2008 presidential race. She's received the Luce Scholarship, the Templeton Cambridge Journalism Fellowship in Science and Religion, the Western Enterprise Reporting Fellowship from Stanford University's Bill Lane Center for the Study of the North American West, and the Woods Hole Ocean Science Journalism Fellowship. Juliet delivered the inaugural Muncie Journalism and Politics Lecture at the University of Kansas Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics in 2006. She's author of the 2006 book, Fight Club Politics, How Partisanship is Poisoning the House of Representatives, and is currently writing her second book on sharks, the kind that swim through the water, not through Congress, which Pantheon will publish in the spring of 2009. I think this April is the month when she's finishing all this up. This is a busy girl. Juliet also serves on the board of the Washington Press Club Foundation, which is an organization committed to supporting women and minority journalists. This is Juliet's fourth visit to Arkansas. Her first was in the pursuit of the ivory-billed woodpecker. I didn't know her then, and I don't think she found it, but I met her a couple of years ago on her second trip when she was a keynote speaker for a legislative human resource management conference. I was charmed by Juliet then and remain in awe of her intelligence, her energy, her integrity, her welcoming personality, and her art for listening. Her fiancé is laughing at that. I don't know that. He may not agree, but we'll talk about that later. The last couple of times she's visited, we've traveled Central Arkansas to numerous speaking engagements, stopping briefly to see some of the best parts of this region of our state. Dean Rutherford met with us one morning last year to give us a personal tour of the library and to answer questions from Juliet about the environmentally friendly nature of the library architecture. This visit presents a great opportunity for us to hear firsthand what's happening on the national political scene. I suspect when Juliet agreed to speak tonight, she had no idea the presidential race would look as it does today. She's just coming off the campaign trail after being in Texas last week covering John McCain's campaign. National Park Community College is so pleased to partner with the Clinton School of Public Service to welcome Juliet back to Arkansas. We want her to feel at home here because we want her to come back often. Please welcome Juliet Alperin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jill, for such a lovely introduction, and to the Dean. And I have to tell you, I'm making slow progress here because the first time I came to Little Rock, I came for this conference, and my office made me write a couple stories, and I didn't get to visit the Clinton Library, and this was a huge, devastating blow for me. And I was really bitter. It was past. I had to write past the time that it was open. So I vowed that next time I would come back, I would get to visit the library. So sure enough, last time I came here, I got to visit the library. Dean Rutherford was wonderful and gave me a tour of the school and things like that. And of course, then my expectations were raised and I wanted to speak here. So I think that maybe next time I either have to enroll in the Clinton School of Public Service or, talk to him about whether the dean's job is going to open at some point. So, but I think that might take a few more visits. So we're going to start right now by me just sharing some of my observations. And I actually think, since Dean Rutherford mentioned the piece that I recently did on John McCain, I'll talk about that. I wrote a story that ran on the front page on Saturday with Michael Shear, my colleague. We switch off and we spend 1 week with McCain and 1 week off, and so luckily he's taking care of it this week. I'll babysit John McCain next week. That's how we mix it up. But what we wrote about was really interesting, and it was about the McCain brand and kind of how McCain's advisors are confident that he has established a brand that is going to appeal to Americans right now. And the brand that they're selling is someone, of course, of integrity, who served his country, but also is willing to reach out across the aisle and work in a bipartisan way, and that basically he's very different from the current Republican brand. And if you talk to people, a lot of people on Capitol Hill, and again, including, for example, Tom Davis, a Republican from Virginia who ran the campaign arm of the House Republicans, would say that the Republican brand isn't doing so well nowadays, and that's one of the reasons that the Republicans voted for John McCain in the primary. And one of the things that I found very interesting, both in terms of reporting this piece and also talking to voters, is people sometimes project ideas onto John McCain that don't necessarily correspond to where he stands. For example, Planned Parenthood recently did a poll asking women, about 1,200 women across the country in key states, where John McCain stood on abortion. Now, John McCain is a strong opponent of abortion. He's never backed abortion rights in any way, shape, or form. He actually opposes contraception coverage in terms of as part of insurance. He's actually opposed to sexual education, things like that. And yet, more women polled thought that John McCain backed abortion rights than didn't. It was 23% of the women said that they thought that he backed abortion rights, 18% said they didn't, and more than 50% said they just didn't know where he stood. And I think that one of the things that's very interesting about that is, again, it tells you much more about voters than it does about John McCain, right? John McCain's actually pretty straightforward on this issue. I've talked about it with him. But the fact is, voters are very anxious for someone who can transcend the traditional political boundaries of what we have right now. And I think what's so interesting when you look at the Democratic race and you look at what's happening between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, that clearly so much of Obama's appeal is not, one thing I always say is that covering the Republican primary, which is what I covered, it was very substantive, right? Because they actually, Mitt Romney and Rudy Giuliani had very different positions on immigration than John McCain, and so forth. Mike Huckabee had a very different position on the economy as his competitors. And I actually wrote about the policy differences between the men who were running for that position. On the Democratic side, because on policy issues there's so little disagreement, obviously you can point out some slight differences, whether it's on health care or whether it's on trade, but for the most part that Obama and Clinton are so similar that really it's become this referendum on who represents what voters are seeking at this moment from their politicians. And I think, and this is again a lot of what I read about in the book, is I wrote about the just incredible polarization that we've had for the past more than dozen years, and essentially how my argument is that politicians have not really represented where the men and women of America are. And again, one of the exceptions would be Bill Clinton actually tried to break through some of those preconceptions. But if you look at what's happened with Congress until recently, you really had politicians on the far left and the far right who came to Washington and fought with each other and called each other's names. And as a result, they really didn't get much done on behalf of their constituents. And then you add in a president who certainly is one of the more ideological presidents we've had in recent decades. And as a result, you've had this kind of impasse. And it's very clear that at this point, people are looking for who's going to break out of it. And I think one of the most interesting tests that we'll see as we move towards the general election is, are Democrats going to take a gamble and vote on someone, support someone who clearly has a less established, a less lengthy term of office and so forth, but, clearly represents, I think, a break with the partisanship of the past? Or are they going to support Hillary Clinton, who clearly one of her selling points is that she knows how to fight the partisan fights in a way that she argues that Barack Obama is not. And she, likes to kind of joke about him and say that, it's not like the heavens are going to break open and angels are going to sing and people are going to play nice in Washington. But I think one of the most interesting things to see is whether, assuming, if, for example, Barack Obama becomes the Democratic nominee and faces off with John McCain, for the first time in a long time, you're really going to have a battle over the middle. And that's something we haven't seen really since, Bill Clinton ran for office the first time. And I would argue that I think that that's pretty healthy for America, that after having such entrenched partisanship, that Americans are really looking for a break. And I think what'll be really interesting is if Hillary Clinton manages to pull it off and becomes the nominee, to what extent is she going to be able to make that argument that she too can be a break in the way that John McCain is surely going to be. And clearly one of the things that Democrats are going to do, and they've already started focus grouping this and testing it with polls and so forth, is that they're going to do the best that they can to place John McCain back in the Bush camp, back in the GOP camp. And, I think what's so interesting is that on policy grounds, they have a very strong argument. If you look at where he stands, whether it's on the war or on taxes or abortion, on many of the key issues that voters focus on, healthcare, his positions are very similar to the Republican establishment. What's different from him is really his personality, his approach, occasionally, obviously, his willingness to break with party lines and reach out. And one of the people who hasn't gotten that much attention recently, and I think that, I quoted him in my piece, and I think you're going to see more of him, it's Joe Lieberman. I mean, it's kind of incredible when you think Joe Lieberman, senator from Connecticut, on the Republican ticket, on the Democratic ticket in 2000 as the vice presidential nominee, and now he's an independent who's actively stomping for John McCain. And I watched him. I've watched him in New Hampshire. I've watched him in Florida. He will meet with little old Jewish ladies in Miami. He will go to pizza joints. He will do whatever it takes to support John McCain. And I think that, that certainly gives you a sense that things are different this time. I don't think I can remember a time. Certainly, again, I think of someone I know, William Cohen just spoke here, and clearly, it was unusual that Bill Clinton chose a Republican senator to serve in his cabinet, and we also saw that Norm Mineta, former Democratic congressman, served in Bush's cabinet. But the idea of someone who, again, was vying for his party's nomination for president is now, just a few years later, pushing for the opposite party to win power really shows you how the political calculus is scrambled this year. And it's a really exciting time to be a journalist. But on the other hand, it's also very difficult because it's very hard to be able to say that, of course, the big battleground states are all that matter. But again, you could see fights over Arkansas that you haven't seen historically. You could see, I think Kansas is certainly a state that people don't think about being in play for the Democrats. But, certainly if Obama was the nominee, Kansas is going to be something they're battling over. And again, I in fact think that ultimately this is going to be helpful because when you look at, we had a very funny thing when the candidates were going, I believe it was to North Dakota when the Democrats were going there, or Wyoming, it was Wyoming, when they were fighting over the Wyoming caucus, I think it was a caucus, when Hillary Clinton and Obama were competing over that, one of the political reporters who sits right near me says, I'm writing about Wyoming and how the Democrats are out there. I want you to find a animal that outnumbers the voters in Wyoming. Like, let's pick an animal that there are more of in Wyoming than registered voters. Not even registered Democrats, which, of course, there are not so many registered Democrats in Wyoming, but just registered voters. So what's great is we embarked on this hilarious thing where we were calling the, Fish and Wildlife and, the game wardens. And what I love is the first time we called them up, they said, well, rats outnumber people. And I said, that's true, but you could say that about Washington, D.C. or New York City or Little Rock, to be honest. So, I don't really feel like the rat thing is going to work so well, So we kept investigating it. And we found out that pronghorn antelope outnumber registered voters. And pronghorn antelope, I can tell you, because I cover the environment, are in trouble right now. So the fact that the antelope outnumber the registered voters is a little crazy. But, that's fine. We're again, a very diverse country. But I think the fact that, these men and women feel obligated to go to these tiny states, in fact, is extremely healthy in a lot of ways. And I think that in many ways, it's going to make them much more accountable to the public than we've seen in a long time. I mean, this is really part, again, of what my book talks about, is the lack of competition, which we also still see to some extent in congressional districts. And one of the things that I'm hoping, and we can talk about this, but I'm hoping that whoever the next president is, he or she does actually do something to change the way we elect our members of Congress, because I think there needs to be more competition. If you want proof of the lack of competition, I have to say, you can look no further than Arkansas, where this is the first time since 1954 that there's not a major party challenge to any federal office holder that you all have here. I mean, which is stunning. And I'm not casting aspersions on whether it's Mark Pryor or, Mike Ross or any of these guys, but the fact that no one thinks that it's worth taking on, including a first-term senator and, some of these members of Congress, gives you a sense of how safe you are if you win federal office in this state and in many states throughout the country. And I think one of the really fabulous things about this presidential race is people really feel that this is a moment where they're going to have an impact on who's elected the next president of the United States. And I think that, the next president will also feel, again, a greater sense of accountability. One thing which some of you might not have seen, this was the little thing that was reported in a bunch of papers a few weeks ago, but when Vice President Cheney was asked about how the war is unpopular, and he looked and he said so, and, when he had an interview with, I believe it was ABC, and then the next day, all these reporters were asking Dana Perino, who's actually a wonderfully kind of helpful and accountable press secretary at the White House, and they asked Dana Perino, do the president and the vice president, do they care about popular opinion at all? And is this an issue for them, or is that immaterial to them? And she kind of answered it a few different ways, and finally she said, look, you got a shot every 4 years. That's what you got. And I thought that was a really kind of stunning comment from a public official, that you have once every 4 years, you have a chance to affect the course of the country. One would usually think that over, in the course of a president's term, he or she would listen to what people are saying and perhaps modify, not necessarily do exactly what people say, but at least be aware of where the public was. And so I think that, one of, again, the really healthy things we'll see, no matter who's elected president, is I think there really will be much more of a dialogue. John McCain likes to say that he just said recently, initially he said that he was willing to have a press conference every week just to speak to the American people through the media, which he always likes to make fun of, and we know that we always get bashed for things, and you're allowed to bash me tonight. That's one of the things if you want to during the question and answer. But so he initially said, he certainly said while the Iraq war is going, he would have a press conference every week. And then just a couple days ago when I was out on the campaign, he said every 2 weeks. So, I'm wondering if there's a little backsliding, but, as long as he keeps it every 2 weeks, we joke that, and Andrew, my fiance, knows this, that, he allows reporters to go at the back of the Straight Talk Express and interview him. And there are times when I'm so tired and I've already filed my story for the day, although I generally file a few times a day, and I'll be told, oh, come on, we're going to have 5 reporters in the back of the Straight Talk Express. And you really just want to say, doesn't he need a little rest? Don't you think you should talk to the candidate about that? But amazingly, despite being 71, really, McCain does have a huge amount of energy. And while I actually do think that his age is going to come up as an issue in the campaign, no matter who's running against him, it is really incredible to see how he does like to interact in the press. And I think that really you are going to have just much more of a dialogue. Again, ideally, to some extent using the media as a medium, and then some extent, just direct Q&A that you're going to have with the next president. And I think that in a lot of ways, hopefully, that will allow us to have the kind of vibrant democracy that I think most people are invested in. And so I think that that's one of the really interesting things that we're facing. And so I could talk for a lot longer, but I know there are so many smart questions in the audience. I'm fairly confident of that. If we could move to questions, and I'm happy to elaborate on these themes. I'm also happy to talk about the environment, since that's also what I cover, whether it's climate change and how the election's going to affect that, or any other issues. I'm happy to do that.
All right, let's have questions. Representative Johnson. I know,
Okay.
but we need you on the mic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. One of my students, I teach AP Government at Bryant High School also, and they're concerned for John McCain, Senator McCain's safety.
Yeah.
They had read in the paper that he is the only candidate that is not receiving Secret Service protection. He's using private, something in the private sector. Could you comment on that in comparison to what you would see the Secret Service maybe being done and not with him?
Right. The true answer, which again, we'll try not to emphasize, that he doesn't have any security right now. He's going to get Secret Service protection, but he doesn't like security. I mean, I'm telling you, I know he's got some beefy guys on staff, so, they can intimidate some wimpy people. But he's resisted having Secret Service on the grounds that, partially that it just costs taxpayers a lot of money, and also that he feels like it hasn't been necessary. We have a theory at the office that the head of the Secret Service, just a week or two ago, testified publicly to say that he didn't have Secret Service, which is something none of us had reported out of concern for his safety. And we feel like that probably happened because they wanted to force him to get Secret Service. So I'm pretty confident that's why it happened. And so, it's just, again, just last week he didn't have Secret Service. I wouldn't be surprised if by this week or next week, I know they're in discussions, and that will happen. I think that this is one of these things. One thing I always say is that I feel like, politicians get such a bad rap in a lot of ways, and there are plenty of reasons to resent politicians, but, they really do put themselves on the line in so many different ways. And I think when you look at either, again, Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, who obviously have considerable Secret Service, they are taking serious risks in running for office. And I think that to some extent, again, regardless of ideology, you should give people credit for the fact that they're willing to do that. And when you see, again, I've been, for example, at an Obama rally, and you look at it, and I think there's something like 8 people on him at any one time, and they really do, they're obviously particularly worried about him and the threats that he faces. But I think that this is one of these things. One of the funniest things about John McCain, having faced death so many times, as people are aware, but both in war and so forth, and in captivity. One of his jokes is one thing I've asked is whether he was a bad pilot, because he did crash 5 times, and you feel like you gotta raise it. That might not be a nice thing to say. Granted, one time he intercepted a missile with his plane. But so we had this discussion, and the funniest thing is anytime there's turbulence, he always likes to joke. At one point there was turbulence on the plane. One of my friends was with him, and he goes, "Trust me, I'm not going to die on a plane. If I die anyway, it's going to be not on a plane." And so, I think he has, faced his own mortality in a way that obviously the other candidates have not, and that, he really has made his peace with it. That said, I think as much as I resent, I'm not looking forward to him getting Secret Service because of how I worry that it'll hamper our access, but I think that at this point it is time. And he would have gotten it at the convention, so it's just a question of right now.
Who do you think is going to be John McCain's running mate?
That's a very good question. And I don't have an easy answer for it. I'll give you some of the qualities of the person I think that he will pick. I think he will pick someone who is significantly younger than himself, because I think there's just a broad acknowledgement that whoever he picks as his running mate potentially could be running for president in 4 years rather than 8. And so I think he's aware of that. I think he thinks that voters will be calculating that. And so I think that will be one of the criteria. He will not pick someone who's as close to his age. I think that beyond that, he will, more so than other candidates, and again, I would give the model which he gives of the Bill Clinton, Al Gore model, that he will pick someone who ideologically is quite similar to him. He is not going to pick someone who's radically different. I think he'll pick someone who's more experienced in the economy than he is, potentially someone who has more executive experience than him, such as a governor. But I don't think he's going to pick someone who, in the interest of balancing the ticket, who per se is from a different region, per se is radically more conservative than him. I don't think he's going to pick anyone more liberal than he is, and he's not that liberal. But I think that he's going to look for someone who voters will perceive as someone who's likely to carry on his legacy should he decide 4 years after being in office. And so, again, there are certain people we always talk about. Mark Sanford, the governor of South Carolina, is someone people raise. My favorite dark horse is Bobby Jindal, the new governor of Louisiana, the first Indian American to be elected to Congress as well as to head a state. So, there are different people in the mix. I also was just bugging them about this week, and one of his top aides said, "Juliet, we got 5 months. We're not gonna bust this out soon," particularly because the public wouldn't pay attention to it. So, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get that news soon. I think it's going to take a while.
Question.
to disclose a bias, I was John McCain's classmate. We were on the boxing team together. And the honor code at the Naval Academy made no distinction between a lie and a misleading statement. For either one, you could get kicked out. And the other aphorism is that, power corrupts. And I wondered if you've ever experienced any misleading statements or any people have caught him telling the truth.
Okay. I mean, I certainly think people would say that he, and I would argue that all the major candidates have made misleading statements at times. The one that comes to mind particularly that I helped cover was when he accused Mitt Romney of being in favor of a secret withdrawal from Iraq, which was during the primary. I think it was during the Florida primary, if I'm not mistaken. And it was either South Carolina or Florida. I think Florida. And I think that a lot of journalists, and we questioned him a lot on this. And it's a very complicated thing because I don't think he thought he was misstating the record. But we made it clear that the facts did not reflect that, and he was not willing to back down from that. And I think one of the things, which actually, again, just speaks to John McCain, again, without, having any partisanship, but just explaining it, he tends, when he believes something or when he comes to a position, he tends to be very fixed in it, and he's not particularly open in reevaluating where he stands on things. And so I think that in some cases that could potentially be something that comes up over the campaign trail when he feels, and for example, when we had these discussions about the war, and he would say, people said my career was over when I said that I was still committed to Iraq and that I would rather lose an election and a campaign than lose the war. And, here Mitt Romney was nowhere and, wasn't public about it. And, well, that's all well and good, and that is accurate, but that doesn't mean that he has the right to kind of project a different position on Mitt Romney just because Mitt Romney did not stake out as bold a public position during that time. And so I think that that's a phenomenon that we have seen and will continue to see in the campaign. And later I'll find out how he is as a boxer, because I'd be curious.
Dr. Scranton.
Thank you for sharing your insights. And I wonder, as a bit of a follow-up, how you would evaluate McCain's qualities of mind, not so much in defending a past record or the positions he's taking now, but the quality of mind he would exercise in office. How rigid, how open to new information. What is your sense?
That's a very good question. And I think actually that's something that I'm going to continue to focus on in the months to come, and part of it is that I think that we don't have a fully clear idea of that for a couple of reasons. Partially it's because he really operated, although again he did form coalitions on campaign finance reform and immigration reform and so forth, but he's really a lone wolf. He's not someone who really, was buddy-buddy with people and worked as a committee chair to kind of bring people together and things like that. And so I think that leaves open a real question mark of what he would be like as an executive. I think that that's one thing that just hasn't been fleshed out. I think, again, there are certain things, if you look at issues like climate change, he was a skeptic back in 2000 when he was running, and he was confronted about this over and over again in 2000. And he did do investigations and ultimately came to decide that, this was a problem, and he did take a leadership position on that. I would certainly say his mastery of the science of climate change is not on par with, say, Hillary Clinton's mastery of the science, and they have traveled together and things like that. So I think one of the interesting things is, for someone who has been in public office as long as he has been, we have less of a sense of how he would operate as president as other candidates we've had in the past. And that is very interesting, and I think, frankly, it's a responsibility of the press in the months to come to do the best job we can to to ferret that out, because I think that's important for voters to know when they're casting their votes.
We know him fairly well, but could you share some of your thoughts about Huckabee on the national scene?
Sure. I did have actually, I would say the pleasure to cover him in the early days, because he, it was fun to cover him. I came down, I was basically focusing on him in, say, November, very, pretty early on. And I think that what what made him successful were a couple of different things. I think people really did connect to his authenticity, and I think it was a reflection of some of the other candidates, mainly Mitt Romney and Rudy Giuliani, that Huckabee did as well as he did. And I think if there's one person who John McCain owes in this entire thing, it's Mike Huckabee, because he would not have won without splitting the vote. And I also think that one of the interesting things is that Mike Huckabee's performance and his kind of success in the campaign really did show to some extent how these endless presidential debates we've been having have been helpful, because he actually was able to, it was kind of incredible. I was starting to interview people and they said, that guy Mike Huckabee, I'd never heard of him, but then I saw him on the debate and he answered this question about X and Y and Z, and I think he actually benefited a lot from having low expectations and surpassing them. That said, I think that he did have, he really did encounter limits into how far he would go. I don't see him as a possible vice presidential pick for McCain. I don't think that's going to happen, and I do think that really beyond proving that he was smarter than people thought and that he's incredibly self-deprecating, he didn't have a full vision or background portfolio to be the presidential nominee. And I think that if he had been nominated, there is no question that the Democrats would win in November. So they definitely escaped a bullet. The Republicans escaped a bullet by not nominating him.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, my name's Tim Chitina. I'm a student at the Clinton School, and I was also an Arkansas traveler up in New Hampshire. I know it was recently leaked by Drudge that McCain may have said something to the effect of, Hillary's still in this, and I welcome the opportunity to run against her, maybe that he'd rather run against her than Obama. But who do you think is an easier opponent for him in the general election, and why?
I would say, if I had to guess one of them, I would say that I think Clinton is an easier opponent for him. I don't think either of them are easy opponents, but I think that they would prefer Clinton partially more than anything else because it will motivate conservative Republicans who do not like John McCain right now that much. And I think that they are very worried about the fact that while publicly they're going to be spending so much time reaching out to independents and to some extent Reagan Democrats and so forth, they really are worried about conservative Republicans staying home. And the best insurance for conservative Republicans to come out is Hillary Clinton. I was up in New Hampshire and ran into some of your fellow travelers who I know suffered through the fire at their hotel, so it shows dedication that you all stuck it out there, and I was impressed with that. But I have to say that I ran into people who said that they were deciding between McCain and Obama. I did not run into people who said that they were deciding between McCain and Clinton. So I think he sees that as a safer bet for him.
You have been watching the Clinton School Speaker Series, a public service program produced by UALR University Television in cooperation with the Clinton School of Public Service.